Alana, you had mentioned to me privately that you're currently working on a book, and you came up, or you sort of launched the project when you were presenting Videodrome at TIFF, correct? Do you want to talk a bit about that experience and why that sort of influenced your book?
Sometimes I wonder if it was just a weird historical coincidence, but I was presenting Videodrome at TIFF when they were celebrating like 100 years of Canadian cinema, and it was the same day as the first big international women's march, which in the aftermath of Donald Trump, right? Like it's a nightmare for women everywhere in the world right now, right? It's like body horror is just our everyday existence in the current moment. And I was watching Videodrome, and I was thinking about this film, which is like all this kind of strange mutations, including, James Wood's character develops kind of like a vaginal opening that's both kind of like a VCR in his body, it's kind of vagina, it's kind of a mouth, we're not really sure what it is, kind of confounds like technology and flesh. And at the end of the film, the main male character, who's kind of like a 1980s TV producing kind of dick, he ends up kind of crossing over to the other side of this fleshly revolution. And the two people who precede him to that other side are an older woman who's a porn filmmaker, and Debbie Harry. And I kind of had never noticed that he was joining forces with what you could really read as a kind of feminist revolution that's really not clearly articulated in the film. And it kind of made me rethink a little bit about like what the mutability of bodies does as just kind of a general feminist statement.
I think, like, especially one of my favorite films of all time is Rosemary's Baby, and especially now it's weird looking at it and being like, this is so super feminist and great and I love it, but it's also created by Roman Polanski, who's like arguably the biggest walking trash can that exists today. So it's just like really, it's a complex area, but I do agree when you guys say that like horror has so much potential to be, to provide really deep and meaningful social commentary and feminist thought, even though it has, a really public image of being not so much that. It's weird.
Well, about that,
yeah.
I can add, I feel like the horror genre is like one of the places where you can address these stories, where you could be like, oh, I'm gonna make a film like that's gonna represent very gruesome reality of something that's a very like real topic that impacts people. But if you made it as a TV movie of the week or a melodrama, people would not even care about it, would not watch it. But because you encode it with horror and then you add those elements, not only you visually represent or use like a metaphor to represent the gruesome reality that is lived by the people, but also you present it and you reach people because the format is accessible. It makes it like, people are gonna watch a horror movie. They might not understand the message or get the underlying themes, but at least they're going to be entertained and you're going to reach more people than you would have in any other genre. For example, the Babadook being
Right.
that being a good recent example.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask Emma about the Babadook because you were saying your focus is a lot on grief and trauma and mental illness, and I know that you have a lot of thoughts about the Babadook and Hereditary and all those movies, so I was wondering if you wanted to speak on that a little bit.
Sure. I saw the Babadook when I was just getting into horror film studies in 2014, and it was just really interesting for me to see this film about this mother character who's having so much difficulty just finding ways to even just like love her son, and just the complexity of being a mother and going through the grieving process. And I just thought it's so interesting because the characters in both Hereditary and the Babadook are so strong because they're not just kind of seen as these, I guess, more flawless female characters, which I think is a representation that is seen a lot now, and even like superhero movies or slasher films like Alien with Ripley, just these characters who are very stoic and kind of flawless. Like, these are characters who have complexities and they have these flaws, so I thought that was a really interesting representation of women in horror.
For sure. This is a question for all of you again. Where do you guys hope to see or think the way we are going is, that wasn't English, but you know what I mean. Where do you think we're going in terms of horror in the Me Too era? Like, do you think that we have to approach representations of sexual violence in horror in a different way now, because I feel like it's always been super present. But I'm just wondering, is there a way of doing that that like is better, and you know, or does it not matter because it's art and who cares?
I mean, I think some of it has to do with professional practices on the set. So a lot of these questions, there's a question that's about content, and there's a question about the kind of production side of things too, right? And so a lot of organizations and productions are now bringing in, for example, like a counselor to think about like, if we're going to stage this kind of violence, how does it affect the people who are actually having to live it? Because one thing that you hear repeatedly from a lot of actors and actresses in particular is that they might have explicitly consented to something at the time, but the power imbalances that we see on set when an industry is so male-dominated, it's so white-dominated, it's just so difficult for people who are traditionally on the margins of that industry to get even a foothold, that you might think, well, I have to do this in order to advance my career. And then talking afterwards about how shitty they felt about the kinds of things that they actually had to endure, which are often not just about the content, but the conditions under which the content was produced. So I think, was it Barry who was talking about how Harvey Weinstein came to the set and was watching her in a nude shower scene, right? So that kind of vulnerability, whereas I think we've all heard accounts about where something really intense can happen on set, but because the conditions are right, because there's conversation, because there's care about having a closed set, that you can understand how to make that a better experience for everyone involved, and still do the kind of work of representation that is necessary in a lot of ways.
Have any of you ever faced adversity or discrimination working in horror, whether it's academically or filmmaking? Like, have you ever personally experienced anything like that?
Yeah, working on sets, especially in film school, was pretty difficult. There was always just this, boys club that was around, and I found that I was always able to sort of get my foot in, but I felt like you were talking about before, like you always have to prove yourself like 10 times more. You always have to put in so much more effort, and then I noticed too that whenever I showed a little bit of vulnerability, I was kind of, I had to just regain that power again. Every time I made like a little mistake, I just had to keep building myself up again. So that's been pretty difficult to deal with. And I think it's like a recurring thing that's happened pretty much every time I've worked on set. So, yeah.
I guess in my case, I was fairly lucky, where like I didn't have, like, aside from like how hard it is to do anything within the film industry, period, like, regardless of gender, like just getting a project off the ground, if you're not connected, or if your daddy is not a multimillionaire or whatever, like it's just extremely hard, Funny enough, I've actually, whenever I have encountered like some, I guess, discrimination, or like people even just like mean comment of be like, oh, do you want to be a makeup artist? If you want to work in movies, that's what you should do, And that's always come from people within, like, I guess the mainstream, where it's like my experience with the horror industry as a genre and the horror like circuit, that's actually the place where I felt like people were most welcoming, and they're like, oh cool, a girl, finally, like come in, like, come sit at the table, like, it's like, it feels like there's like a bit more openness, just maybe because the genre itself is sometimes like looked down upon, like, by people. So they're like, oh, it's great, like, we need some diversity. And I think people within the industry, they even say it, like, we need more diversity. They just not always show it. But yeah, that was my experience. And also in academia, maybe because that was like 10 years ago, I actually got more pushback from women than men, like when I said that I wanted to work on horror. So yeah, there's a lot of people, like some people told me that I was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with women today. I remember it to this day, but it's okay.
That's wild.
Wow. I mean, I have to say, for academia, I hear everything you're saying. I did some film production in grad school, and I was always the only woman in the class. And then when we do group projects, they always be like, you can act, instead of like, you can run the camera or set the lights or something like that. So it's exciting to see that there's a lot of efforts to actually change this in really kind of concentrated ways. You gotta kind of follow the money and then get the money in the hands of the people who haven't had access to it. But in academia, I've had a really different experience, and I think it's in part because historically, when film studies comes into the academy in the 1970s as an area of study, it comes in as feminist film studies from the start. So unlike like studying English literature, where you had to kind of like beat the door down to get any kind of feminine content in the university, when it's recognized by the university, it's all women who found film studies. Laura Mulvey wrote an article that maybe some of you know, called Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, which is the origin of this idea of the male gaze, which I think lots of people understand that as a concept, even if you're not an academic. And it's the most read article in any film studies context ever. There's not a lot of fields where you can say that, where like feminism has kind of dominated the conversation. I think that's really cool. And all those women were also working a lot on genre cinema. They were working with all these kind of weird pleasures of like popular culture, and they kind of made that respectable right from the start. So I think there's something interesting about the history of film studies as a field, where women have actually been really powerful in shaping that from the beginning. It doesn't always play out, because academia is an industry like anything else, right? So there's not a lot of women in those jobs, but I always found that really comforting. And so my experience was always working with mostly feminist and sort of queer professors who really understood that pop culture was one place where marginalized voices really got to speak out and experiment with like what it felt like to take center stage.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I find like almost every single woman I've spoken to, whether they're a filmmaker, an academic, a journalist even, they've experienced like one form of sexism or another. I mean, personally, like just as a fan and a writer, like I feel like I often encounter that sort of, oh, you like horror, name 5 movies, like, you know, that stupid sort of mindset where they're like, prove it, there's no way you can be interested in this, it's impossible, which I find ridiculous, because like we have been saying, there's so much with female-made horror and like themes, which is so interesting to me that people always are doubting that. I don't know why. What I think it's interesting also because I know a lot of women filmmakers who often say, you know, they make a point to inject feminism into their work. I know, Moat, you definitely do in a lot of your work. I've noticed a lot of female filmmakers do that, inject feminism into their work, but I know a lot of women also make it a point to like not. Like they're very verbal about like, no, I don't want to do that, I just want to make like a good movie, and it doesn't matter if it's made by a woman or a man, it just has to be good. And I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that mindset, or how do you like reconcile those two things?
I feel like I do, but it's not always conscious. I think it's just the type of stories that I'm into, and it's the way I guess my brain works. But I feel like myself, I think of myself as falling in that second category, where like I just want to make a good movie that people are going to enjoy. My first feature was very feminist, as you mentioned, and that actually I got some pushback from that. People be like, oh, it was like a love it or hate it for that exact reason. People say, oh, this is like, this was not palatable enough. This was not a feel-good movie. This was not an enjoyable film. And I feel like, not that I want to like censor myself, but it feels like I tried that. Now I want to try the other side of it, like, you know, because I feel like it's just like myself as a woman. Like I think the way I think, like the type of stories that I'm drawn to, like the type of stuff that I write. I think there's always going to be a little bit of me in there. Like no matter, even if I tried to make like a superhero movie tomorrow, like, you know, I would still have like a little, because it just comes down to the little details. It can come down to like, which kind of shots do you do? Like how long do you linger on a certain body part? Like, you know, in certain situations, like, you know, it's just like the decisions like that can like just make it be like, it's just like consciously or unconsciously, there's always going to be a little bit of like, you know, yourself and what you think in there, you know.
Yeah, because you're a woman, so it's like inherently there's going to be female experience like put into your work. Yeah, that's interesting. Emma, I know you mentioned to me that you have done a bit of research on POC, or people of color representation in horror film, and I just wanted to get you to speak on that a little bit, because I've noticed, I mean, especially in the last few years, we've had this like renaissance with Jordan Peele, with like amazing, again, like Lupita Nyong'o's character in Us was like a super strong Black female character, and I just wanted to know what your research was on and what kind of, what way you approach that topic.
It's interesting because when we're talking about, you know, American horror films that represent people of color, it's very, very rarely women. So most of my research has been more based on male characters. And that's why I was so surprised when I did see Us, because that's really like one of the first representations, at least, of like an African-American female character who's really put just center stage and just has like this really complex character and doesn't just get, you know, killed off in the first few minutes of the film. There's a few others out there. There's the Iranian film Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which is Persian language, but it's American made, and I thought that was also a really interesting representation of person of color in film. But yeah, it's still really, really lacking. We still have like a couple of them, but I think a lot of work needs to be done there.
Yeah, of course.
There's a great feminist film festival called the Final Girl Film Festival in Berlin every year, which features horror films made by women. And I saw two great things there this year. One was based on like a blog or a podcast, and I'm really sorry, I was moving and I'm so disorganized and my phone died, so I wanted to look up the name because I'm terrible with titles. But it's a woman, African-American woman who's doing research into African-American women characters, and it's called something like My Final Girl or something like that. Totally Google it. But she was looking at the history of women POCs in horror movies and found some fantastic examples and did like a little short film about it. But she also does, I think, a weekly podcast on it. It's fantastic. And then the other thing I saw that I thought was great, is like nothing else I've ever seen, is a recent Brazilian movie featuring a kind of werewolf and sort of surrogacy and pregnancy and queer relationships that kind of cross racial and class boundaries. And I'm also forgetting the name, I don't know if that's ringing a bell for anybody, but it was a very recent film, woman director, and a feature-length film, which is also quite rare. And I thought it was one of the best horror films that I've seen in recent years, and it was because it really centered this black female Brazilian character. And the name will come to me, but I really recommend it. Again, I highly recommend Googling it and trying to check that out.
Cool. So if you guys are ready, I think we should turn it over to the audience and see if anyone has any questions. Anyone? Yes.
So at one point you did mention, you know, male directors writing female characters and they're doing a pretty good job. And then we just had the discussion on people of color. And as a creator, I certainly want to fill my work with diversity and different characters. But how can we, as white female creators, incorporate people of color into our stories without appropriating? How can we, you know what I mean? Like, how can we incorporate them and it's their story and still make it a good story and still get something genuine?
It's a good question. Does anyone have any thoughts?
I mean, one thing is collaboration, and also to ask the question, like, why do you want to tell a certain story? And like, what do you need to be able to tell that story, right? So, I mean, it's not an example from horror, but I think one of the best examples that I've seen in recent years is the TV series Pose, for instance, which has really taken seriously the question of trans representation and made sure that in the writer's room, in the director's chair, it's a TV series, so there's also more opportunities to kind of populate it with a diverse population, but really foregrounding the voices of the people who are being represented who often been misrepresented. So, you know, you can think about what are the opportunities for collaboration, for working together, but also asking questions like, whose story, why am I interested in telling this story, and when do I need to be able to start telling this story?
Also, there's the, well, I mean, that's more from an ethical standpoint, but especially if you're trying to tell the story of underrepresented, but also any kind of group that has been misrepresented in the past. I'd like to push it a notch further and be like, yeah, the question of like why you want to tell that story yourself is one thing, but it's like, why don't you look, because most likely there's somebody from that group who has a great, like, you know, that I'm thinking also maybe from like the sense of like a director, where it's like there's probably someone who has a great script and they don't want to direct, or if not, it's like, it feels to me like, I think like cultural appropriation is really bad, and it has to be, these are waters that need to be treaded very carefully, and I feel the same way myself, where it's like, oh, I want to help give a voice to, like, you know, anyone who I feel like I can help, but it's might not be my place all the time. So like there might be other ways, like, you know, like for example, like I'm currently working on a project that deals with a mental illness that I'm not familiar with, but I'm working very closely with somebody and like, you know, asking like question, and like there's this collaboration where like that person told me I'm not able to write, but like I want you to like, I'm gonna tell you those ideas, like I want you to put them on the screen, but I don't know how to do it. So like we're like very like closely collaborating on that, and in the end like I'm gonna give a co-writing credit, like, you know, we are basically writing it together. Even if I'm doing the actual writing, this is like that person's story, you know, so I'm not appropriating it at my own, like, you know, but like I'm like, the way I can help is by giving my knowledge of like how to write, you know, as a tool, but like it's very much like her story and like she's writing it, so yeah.
Yeah, I would say amplifying rather than telling someone else's story. I
Yeah.
think that's pretty much, yeah. Anyone else? Valak?
Yeah.
Can I just add something to this really great question that I've grappled with in my own work as a writer and kind of mentoring people? I've noticed in various fields of journalism and film industries that mentorship has this hierarchy where a lot of young white men end up having male mentors. And there's even, you know, there's articles, many of you have probably seen, where men are often afraid to meet with women alone now, so they're losing these mentorships. And what I have been trying to do is, if I meet someone who's a writer and has a kind of identity that doesn't intersect with my own, I try and do what other people have done for me in that position. I think that's like part of compensation that people who are in a position of power should kind of share, yeah, compensation and resources. And what you're saying about co-writing credit is really great. Another thing I wanted to share is that I think a lot of white people, including myself, have been very afraid to talk about race and talk about it in the wrong way. And what happens is we're so afraid of tokenizing that we then hire or only work with white people. And that actually consolidates white supremacy. And I think I've been trying to work on not being embarrassed if I'm clumsy about talking about race, and also trying to make sure I'm reading a lot so that I at least kind of can't just make an excuse. And I've noticed a lot of things getting very apolitical sometimes in some academic discourse, because I think people are, like a lot of white men are afraid to talk about feminism or women or lesbians or whoever in the wrong way. And I think there's this kind of vulnerability we have to take in our positions of whatever privilege we have in order to make things more distributed. Well, I just want to say that.
Can I just say there's two really nice points in what you said. One is, I think, about mentorship, but I think we can also think about peer mentorship too, right? Like for a lot of women in the industry, it's so hard, again, to get your foot in the door. You're often the only woman in the room, right? So one of the best things I think you can do is like go lateral rather than hierarchical. I think that kind of hierarchy, when you have that power to pass it on to someone else, awesome. But also there's power and strength in numbers. So think about how you can also like, you know, be with your peers and try to create community that way, which I think is really important. But the other thing you said is do your homework. So if you're like, you know, I don't know enough about the history of like POCs and horror movies, like go and do your homework, because they're being made, right? And they're often being made in forms that are hard to get your hands on, like short films, for example, because it's hard to break in and make a feature, as you know, right? So go seek that stuff out, find out the people who are doing that work, and then also screen it, show it, host screenings, like share it with your friends, like try and like draw attention to it, find ways to sort of amplify those voices in that way too, because then you start to get other people bringing in more perspectives, and you see that actually that work has already been done, it's just no one's seeing it, no one's remembering it.
If I can just add on to this, also that's how the women in horror movement a lot got started, by creating like ready-made program. There was this festival in pre-2010 that was mostly an online festival called the Viscera Film Festival, which was all horror movies directed by women. And what they would do, it was like a virtual festival, whereas like it didn't have an actual like screening up until like its 4th or 5th year. But the years prior to then, the selected shorts would be put on a DVD compilation, and that program would also be offered to other festivals. Be like, do you want more representation? Here's a bunch of shorts made by women, you know? Please help us get more representation. Please show these films so like there's more platform. And I think that's it. The whole women in horror movement got started with like, you know, people saying organize events in your cities, like, you know, promote the few, you might not know a lot of horror filmmakers, promote the ones you know, look out, just research, you know, find what exists and give that a platform. And I think this is good for any group that doesn't have access to, I guess, a more wide distribution of, like, distribution channel, you know, it's just about like seeking out those work and talking about them, promoting them, sharing them, like very much like just making them seen, like trying to like tell people about them until it becomes normalized and you no longer need to classify it being like, oh, this is a, like, these are movies directed by women. No, these are like good horror movies because representation, like, you know, the diversity has been like reached or whatever, you know.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that also, I mean, working as a journalist, I definitely resonate with a lot of what you're saying in terms of tokenization and sort of being worried that someone's gonna think I'm just reaching out to them because they're Black or because they're Asian or whatever. And I think from just asking, what I've experienced a lot of is they'll just tell you, you know, no, like just be straight up with me that you need like a Black perspective or whatever, like what you're actually seeking, and that you do want their perspective and for them to share and to like collaborate, rather than, you know, just like trying to hide that that's what you're doing and be like, no, I'm just super inclusive. Like just be straight up with them, I think is what a lot of people, and pay them, that helps a lot too, you know, resources. Unfortunately, a lot of us don't have that, but if you do, pay them. And yeah, just, you know, don't be scared, because I think closing down that dialogue, like you were saying, is dangerous, and it does cause a lot of apolitical work, and that's not something that is great.
And also there's a thing about like one way, something I forgot to mention when we were talking about like cultural appropriation and dealing with things that are not from our own culture. I feel like it's one thing to want to tell, like, you know, let's say I'm fascinated with Japanese culture, but I'm not, let's say I would not write a film about Japanese characters, but I could write a film about a white woman going to Japan and dealing with that culture clash. You know, I think that's it. Like there's creative ways to like, you know, to like be able to tell these stories in collaboration with the right people, but without like, you know, stealing from like cultures. Like, you know, you can tell it like, you know, stories of friendships, like you can tell, like, you know, you can address those things but from your perspective while also injecting that other that other cultural or underrepresented groups, like, you know, perspective in there as well. So
other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier like rape revenge is like a kind of subgenre of like horror films. I think for me personally, like as a survivor, like I hate seeing explicit like graphic scenes like that on screen. Especially I think because most of the time I'm watching them and the directors are white men, and it drives me crazy that they think that they're like able to tell this story properly. And I feel like more oftentimes than not it's used as like a scare tactic rather than like this is an issue that like we need to address in like a public and explicit way. So I guess my question is like, do you see a shift now with like kind of the Me Too movement and like the way that that is being handled in horror movies?
well, I think rape is represented like very differently if you look at the work of women directors versus male directors, mostly because I think there's a lot of rape scenes that have been overly sexualized in the past, and that was like the unwritten rules, or like that's the way things were done. But I think now with this, like people are becoming more conscious of it. Like, you know, they're being more careful in the way that they represent it. Like I haven't really paid attention to any like representation of rape in the post-Me Too by men, like, you know, necessarily. But like I did see, I don't know if you heard of that film Revenge, which was a French film directed by a woman last year. That was done in a very different, like the rape scene was represented in a completely different way, like something that like I felt was so different from the standards of it, you know? So I think it might just be a question of time before like things adapt and things are represented differently I know this is not a full answer to your question, but like, I guess that's what I can add to what you said.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't seen any rape revenge films come out in the recent years, so I can't really.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of dying out in a
Yeah.
sense. I think that like people are moving away from just having rape as like a plot device, like they're just gratuitously like, oh, this will work, and realizing that like this is a real thing that people experience in real life, and sort of starting to portray it in. Well, I agree with them. I haven't seen a lot of it, but I feel like if filmmakers were going to make a movie about it now, they'd try and focus on portraying it in a meaningful way, if at all.
Well, I think, isn't it the new film by the director of the Babadook, a rape revenge movie? Basically.
Oh, I have no
I
idea,
don't know.
honestly.
And it's caused a lot of controversy, but I think one of the things, the way that the conversation has changed is that people are starting to ask, why is this necessary? Why do we have to see this to be able to get to the stuff that I think a lot of the older rape revenge movies opened a certain kind of conversation? But now people are asking, why do we need to see this? And we saw that with Game of Thrones, for example, which again, like, happened on both sides of the camera, both in terms of the content and then also in terms of like, why is this something that we need to see? How is it moving the plot forward? Why is it necessary? And what is it reflecting in society? And are there other ways to get to this question? And I think we see it with something like The Handmaid's Tale too, right? Like, why do we need to see this level of gruesome sexual violence on a regular basis? And what are we learning from it? And I think in a lot of cases, like, actually we're not learning anything from this in the way that it's being represented. So I think that's a conversation that survivors have really brought to the table in a really important way.
Yeah. Yeah, one that comes to mind specifically is I Spit on Your Grave. I don't know if you guys have seen it. Yeah, it's that kind of thing where you're like, do we really need this? Like, it basically, for those of you who don't know, it's just like this woman gets violently, assaulted by multiple men, and then she goes on like a rampage, killing all of them later. Which like a lot of people were like, yeah, get them, and then some people were like, why did I have to watch that? So it is worth asking, and I think, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I find I Spit on Your Grave is historically interesting because, that did take rape and kind of make it the center of a film instead of just having it kind of as a plot device to go from, one point of the story into another. So I thought in that aspect it was kind of interesting, but to take that into a modern context, like we were talking about, it's been done. It doesn't need to be redone. There's not that much that you can add that's going to be that. It's like a shock factor at this point. So yeah.
Yeah, could you imagine making that film without having to see the rapes in order to understand, say, the violent murders that follow, right? I mean, I think that's one of the kinds of questions, especially when that film got remade. I mean, I think that was now almost 10 years ago as well, but still, there's that when that film was remade, there was that question: why are you remaking this, and why are you making it in this particular way? And at that time, there was a lot of emphasis on sort of shifting the point of view and being sort of even more feminist, but I think it's not always a pretty compelling argument, actually.
Yeah, I would actually argue that if you're a filmmaker and you're saying, oh, there's no way to make an interesting horror film without a violent rape scene, it's like, well, then you're not a very good filmmaker. Like be creative,
But also adding to this, one other example that hasn't been mentioned, and I just think it's really interesting, is American Mary. I don't know if some of you have seen this, which is essentially a rape revenge film directed by two women, but it's very different, and it turns into this body horror movie, and it's just like, the way it's represented, you barely see it, like it's more suggested than anything, and I feel like that's like a very interesting way to go about addressing that type of things, because it deals more with the aftermath and what it does to the main character than the actual thing in itself.
Also, yeah, it deals more with the character than just the act of the rape, which is really important.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry.
When the idea of the rape revenge movie in this book by Carol Clover came out, where she developed this theory of the final girl, one of the things that she said that was shocking to her as kind of an academic going and sitting in movie theaters watching these super violent movies that really sexualized rape is that she felt that it turned the audience, both kind of put them in the shoes of the woman who's being raped, an audience that was largely young men at that point. But I think one of the things that's also shifted today is that we understand that it's, the audience for slasher films and horror films is actually not just young men. So where does that argument go in terms of what's the utility of these scenes as well? So I think that's always the question.
We have time for one more speed round question. If anyone has anything that's a burning burning question they need to ask. Yeah, I see a hand, yes.
What are your thoughts on the discrepancy between male representation as characters in horror movies and female, the way they're presented, the way they're portrayed, filmed?
There was a survey that came out 2 or 3 years ago from this organization that Gina Davis runs at Google, I think it was, and they said that horror films are the films where women speak more than any other genre of film ever. But you know, if it's all like, no, don't, then it's not good. You know, we need to kind of do like a more fine-tuned Bechdel test
Yeah.
thinking about that. But there's something interesting about the presence of women on screen as speaking characters in horror that outweighs everything else.
I also feel that it's the one genre where like the character arc are evenly developed, so that's all I'm gonna say because
Yeah.
I'm proud.
Yeah, that's time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We had great conversation. Thank you to our panelists.